One thing that really helps is linking it to an organizational purpose or vision or values. And with a direct linkage, you can then demonstrate benefit more easily.
Welcome to Process Pioneers, the show that takes a deep dive into the minds of decision makers, key influencers, and process experts who are pioneering the world of everything process. Welcome to the next episode of Process Pioneers. My name is Daniel Rayner. I'm the host of Process Pioneers. And in today's episode, I have the absolute privilege of sitting down with Cameron Zabel. Now, Cameron has held various process roles over the past 25 plus years. So a lot of experience we're going to be diving into today, including roles such as head of process and analysis at large financial service organizations, I guess you could say, in the Australian market. So very excited for this conversation. I had a brief catch up with Cameron just before we started rolling. And we're going to really be exploring what does it take to, I guess, get that adoption in your organization for BPM. If you've attempted this or you're in the process of this, you would understand that it's not just about getting one person or a couple of people on board. There are many different stakeholders and people in the organization that, you need to bring them on board or bring them along for the journey for BPM to be a success. So we're going to dive into a bit of that today. So Cameron, thanks for sitting down with me and having this chat today.
Great to be here, Daniel. Great to meet you as well.
Thanks. So one question I'm sure the audience would love to know, you've got 25 plus years of experience. How did you end up in the BPM space? Is it something you were formally sort of trained and qualified in, or did you stumble into it through one of your previous roles?
Stumbled into it like many do. I did a lot of project management work, and at one point, so this is 1996, I was working in the Lend-Lease group. And for those who don't know Lend-Lease, they're a big and one of Australia's most successful property management companies. And I think for 18 years, they had a consistent track record of somewhere between 6 and 8% profit growth. The graph just looked, analysts totally loved it. It looked perfect on profit delivery. But of course, property is a cyclical market. And so Lend-Lease had this quite brilliant idea, which was after Paul Keating came in with superannuation in Australia and legislated the ratcheting increases of contributions, Lend-Lease said, if we could get into that superannuation industry, we're going to get this nice cash cow of consistent increasing revenue that will allow us to ride the peaks and troughs of the property cycle. So I think it was about 1990, Lend-Lease bought MLC. And I don't know whether they anticipated this or not, but the culture differences between a property organization and a financial services organization were quite significantly different. So there were some, partly derogatory terms around. They talked about the hard hats and the cardigans. So the cardigans, sat around pushing pencils in front of computers, and the hard hats did real work. But Lend-Lease was well known for their project management skill. And so they thought another benefit of having this financial company is they could teach them how to do project management, clean up their act, and get their costs under control. So 1996, my boss gets this phone call saying, guess what? Lend-Lease has brought in McKinsey, and they've told us we have to do what they then called core process redesign. So we got to cut all the costs out of the business that are unnecessary, redesign all the processes, make everything super efficient. And we're going to run it like a project because that's what we know how to do. We run projects. So because I was a project manager, she looked at me and she said, I don't think we're going to have to get you to lead this thing. And so they're going to send over the Harvard MBA from McKinsey, who's going to tell us what to do, basically, with a bit of eyeball rolling. So the Harvard MBA turns up, who's a McKinsey consultant, and there are about 20 of us in the room. Everyone they decided should be on this project, and a bunch of senior executives. And the consultant walks in and gave this really brilliant description of the project and how we were going to do it, and the approach they take, and some of the benefits we get, and that. And it was quite good. And so, my boss and I were looking at each other thinking, well, this actually could be a really good experience. So I ended up running this project that was doing core process redesign. So that's how I got into it via project management. Now, as it turned out, I'd found out shortly thereafter that consultant got ambushed. They thought they were coming to have a one-on-one conversation just around, we're setting up this project and here's what it's about. And she walks into this room with 20 senior executives, all of their suits and ties, kind of staring at her. And the consultant was Patty Akopians, who ended up about 3 years later was a non-executive director of Coles Myer, and is now one of the most well-known female company directors in Australia. Currently,
Wow.
a non-exec director of KPMG, and she was a brilliant, bright person. And so, as McKinsey does, they hire these geniuses. And so she didn't end up working on my project, but another McKinsey consultant did, who was absolutely fantastic. And so they taught us a lot of the disciplines of process management and BPM. So that inadvertently, I got off to a really good start in the industry, and then that led to a bunch of other things. And I haven't done process work ever since. I've done a few other roles, but I've had 3 or 4 roles that have been very heavily process focused.
Great. No, that's good. And obviously you've seen process in different contexts, in different organizations where there's different culture and there's different challenges, and every organization do have their different nuances. What out of all of that, what drives an organization to adopt this process management approach? You obviously you told us about the Lend-Lease and MLC, sort of part of their story there and what drove them. What are the common drivers for an organization that you're aware of or that you've been part of?
Yeah, I think that it's pretty consistent. There's a pretty short list of drivers. So in the Lend-Lease example I gave, get cost out of the business. So lots of organizations have that view, especially in financial services, where cost to income ratio is a key measure that analysts look at. And if it ever goes up instead of down, everyone starts to panic and figure out, how do we get costs out? There's also, some companies do it for risk. And I think that's been happening increasingly now, that they're understanding the risk of a process going wrong. And if it does go wrong, what's the impact of that? And, that impact might be quite difficult to manage. So we've got to get in proactively and manage that risk so that it doesn't come back to bite us. And then, a lot of industries are under margin squeeze as well. So, they're getting more and more competition from fintechs or wherever the competition is coming from, that's just putting more pressure on their market share and their profit profiles and that sort of thing. So it's usually one of those drivers. It's often more stick than carrot. There's something we have to do, rather than, you were telling me earlier about the NBN example, where the chief executive just got it and kind of went in and said, we're going to do things this way because he had a process background and knew the value of it. But many executives don't. And even if they do, they're just subjected to a whole bunch of other drivers from shareholders and constituents. So they need to, just manage what they think is most important, which often isn't process. So it's one of the big challenges to help organizations adopt process management, is just helping them understand the value and where that value is going to come from. And of course, there's a bit of a chicken and an egg there as well, because until unless you implement process insights, you can't really measure clearly the value. So you've got to come up with ways of sort of slightly less precisely and at a higher level identifying value that, if we implement this, these are the sorts of benefits that are going to get delivered. And I'm not pretending that's easy. It's a big challenge to get organizations to back you. And then often what happens is, as I think you noted with NBN as well, that you get an executive who strongly backs something, that person then moves on, and whoever's left behind or steps in is going to bring a different set of priorities to the table, right? And so if they haven't got a really clear understanding that's handed over around where the process impacts and benefits and value came from, then they might just say, oh, that's easy, low-hanging fruit for cost savings. We have this team over here. We can save some money. So one of the key themes I think that will come out of our conversation today is around sustainability. I think it's the number one challenge that organizations face with process is how do you make sure you create something that is sustainable and is going to endure and is not just a function of the executive or the point in time or the emergency or the necessary legislative response or, all those things can create tension in the system in a particular point in time that actually doesn't last. And so that's a really big challenge.
Great. Well, I'll get you to answer your own question there. How do we make it sustainable? I think it makes sense to dive into that.
Excuse me. Actually, I got COVID about a month ago, Daniel. I've had this cough that's just it's relentless. So apologies in advance, and I'll try and do my best. I have my little home remedies of fresh ginger and lemon. So, I'll try and get my way through it. So yeah, how to make it sustainable. I've done up a little list here. I think there's 6 aspects to sustainability with process. And, each of them is difficult, but at least we can understand what those dimensions are, and then at least be on the front foot about how do we manage these things, will help your chances of success. But I think one of your podcasts was called "This is Going to Hurt," and it's painful. Some of this, it's really hard. And the bigger the organization, the harder it can be. Although smaller organizations can be hard as well, because just spending anything on a superfluous, anything that's outside of your core product or service offering, is hard work for a small company to sustain as well. So it's almost, it's hard wherever you look. Yeah, we can move on to that as well. And then I had a few more comments about, how do you get buy-in, which we can come back to if you like.
Yeah, great.
Yeah. So it was actually the first point around making it sustainable is ensuring you have buy-in. And I think an executive sponsor is fundamental. You can't do it without an executive sponsor. If it's the CEO, fantastic. But if it isn't the CEO, at least someone that's influential and has, good rapport with their peer group and can be persuasive. But that alone, I think, won't solve it, because in addition to the executive, you've got to have some kind of like people infrastructure that if something happens to that person or they change roles, there are other people who get it, who can advocate for it, and who can help bring it to life and help, as people move around, the new people can still understand the value of it and not see it, hopefully, as that low-hanging fruit to save some money. So that's a challenge. But in the situations that I've worked in more recently, one of the big drivers has been regulatory. So especially in financial services, the amount of legislation is absolutely crazy. I worked at one of the big 4 banks, and I think they determined there were more than 3,000 legislative obligations that they needed to comply with. And, so if you think you're the CEO of a bank and you got 3,000 obligations that come out of the Corps Act or class orders from the regulators or whatever they are, how on earth you could even remember a quarter of those things is virtually impossible. So you would have to embed some kind of a system. And I think in the last decade or so, that's been a driver for quite a few organizations as they realize the consequences more, and that, royal commissions and boards spilling and the implications of getting it wrong now are much more significant than they used to be. So that can be a really good driver for buy-in. So that was point number 1 with sustainability. You got to have buy-in. It's got to be an executive and more than an executive, some other senior people who are influential to help sustain it. The second thing is ownership. And I think that applies at a couple of levels. So one is, so if you create some process models, who owns them? And what I mean by that is who's accountable for making sure they are accurate and that they're kept up to date. So the most successful model I've worked with, which still has some flaws, is so one organization appointed an owner for every single process that it had modeled. So there wasn't a single process that didn't have an owner. And in big organizations that are matrixed, you've got functional matrix responsibilities and lines of business. And that's really handy because often it's actually not clear who owns a process. There's somebody who operates it, but there's somebody who benefits from it, and it crosses different divisional units and that sort of thing. And so, a few years ago, they had a real problem with people just throwing up their hands and saying, well, that's not my process. And, it ended up being nobody's process, right? And so when it broke down, everyone was looking at somebody else thinking, well, it wasn't my problem. So appointing an owner for every single process was a fantastic idea. You still need to drive out clarity, though, around, does the owner then have the responsibility for making sure the process maps up to date? And therefore, do they need the skill to do that? So what tool are you using and how complex is that tool? And, do they understand the notation and that sort of thing? Or do they have an appointed delegate who does that, who has those skills? And then, of course, there's a centralized model, right, where you say, well, we're going to put all of our process experts in one place, and anyone who needs help, they can hire them out from that place. And each model has pros and cons, of course, but just being clear on which model are we actually using is really important, because we've run into lots of situations where people said, well, I'm not process owner, but I didn't think I had to update the model. I didn't even know how to use it, right? And in fact, some people say, I don't even know how to read it. You show me the map and I'm kind of, turning it around going, I don't even really understand what this means.
Right.
Excuse me. Sorry, I'll give myself a little lemon ginger top up.
Yeah, appointing an owner, I think, just while you have your top up there, it's come up, I think there was one interview I did with Linda Field, and a big sort of emphasis of that conversation was around who owns it when it's going well, and can celebrate those wins, but who owns it when it's not going well and need to, be responsible for the performance of that process and, the stakeholders in that process. And, and a big part of, you mentioned that sort of centralized model of having the process experts or specialists. I've also heard a number of different models of empowering the wider business to work on their own processes, to have that centralized model, but not where they're a bottleneck and they can only work on X number of processes because of limited resources, but they're actually equipping and empowering their business to be able to work on their own processes, leverage the ideas and the expertise of the people that are doing the roles, doing the tasks, doing the activities on the front line, so that they have ownership of it. Because the whole other part of it is, it's great to change a process on a map, but what does it actually practically look like when you're trying to bring those people along the journey that they've been doing the same role for the last 5-10 years? It's second nature to them. All of a sudden, you're being like, hey, we're going to do it differently. You want to avoid any potential resistance to that sort of the change of process as well.
Yeah, absolutely. You raised some really great points there around. So if you got a process model, which is a visual representation of a process, what is that used for? Is it solely a communication tool? Is it a training tool? Typically, environments I've worked, they're not used while people are actually operating a process. They don't look at a map. They'll look at procedural notes and very specific guides, and the process is that model abstracts that at least one level, sometimes two levels away from what the person's actually doing. So a lot of these where the expertise sits and the people who really get, this is the risky part, this is the difficult part, this is the long duration part. They look at the models and they go, oh, I don't know who that's for. And so, I don't really care what it says. So I just keep my procedures up to date, and then the procedures get misaligned with the models and, that sort of thing. So there's no right answer here, but at least being clear on what are we using it for? Is it the thing we send to the regulator to explain to them what we do? Or is it the thing we use as a training tool? And then if there's another thing like a procedure document, how do we just keep those things aligned, and who does that? So those are really important questions, because as soon as you get that misalignment, then you've lost sustainability, right? So, you come back later. So this was one of the early learnings for me, which really hit the sustainability point home. Is so when I managed that core process redesign project took about 6 months, and we implemented a whole bunch of change and saved 39% on the cost base and that sort of thing. And about a year later, the executive called me up and said, hey, I want you to come back and do a review, a sort of post-mortem. We put that in. Is it still working? Has it got better? Has it got worse? What's happened with it? And so I came back and did this review. And, what became quickly very obvious is that process environments are not static, right? They're dynamic. So the processes are constantly changing, and some of the products and services that are being supported get more complex. And so when all those changes happen, are the processes keeping up to date with that? So of course we came back, and the process models a year later were exactly the same as how we left them.
Right.
But all these changes, and now people said, oh yeah, well, so we do this extra branch, we haven't written it down, but we all know what we're doing, right? But of course, person in seat number 1 and the person in seat number 2 do it a little bit differently. And so, a lot of variation had come in, and the models make it look like processes are static because, they're written down and they're on a piece of paper, right? But finding a way to keep up with those dynamic changes and back to ownership. If it's super clear who owns it, and there's somebody working with that or monitoring to make sure that those things are happening, and you got a fantastic asset. And I think this is one of the things that's really often ignored or maybe not understood, is the extent to which a library of process models is an organizational asset. So in one of the banks I worked at, they were spending about $1.5 billion a year on projects. And almost every project I came across to a certain extent was documenting current state. Saying, okay, well, we got to, we're doing this new product or a new service or something, and we're putting this change in place, but the change has to work in the existing ecosystem. We don't totally understand that ecosystem. So we got an army of people out there documenting processes, digging up procedures, trying to figure out how this stuff works so that we know what it is we're going to change. So it was really hard to estimate, but I came up with probably $100 million a year was being spent on documenting current state for projects to change that current state into something else. Right. And if the process library was up to date and healthy and sustained, that entire cost would just be removed and would more than fund the sustenance of the existing process models, right? But I think a lot of organizations don't appreciate the value that's embedded in that, just from a business change perspective.
Yeah, no, that's good. So when it comes to sustainable BPM, obviously exec buy-in is key. We touched on appointing an owner of having process ownership. You mentioned there were 6 key points there. Yeah.
So the third one I had is understanding value, and I just touched on one aspect of it, which is the asset that is your process repository. So that's kind of the internal view of value. But there's also an outside-in view of value, like from a customer's perspective. So for each process, if you're clear on how does this process add value to my client or customer, and what's its potential to detract value? So every process you think, okay, if this process goes horribly wrong, what's the worst case here? What can happen and how bad is that? And if it goes right, how good is that and what's going to be the impact on the customer experience? And I think if you have that understanding for every process, it really helps you identify where you need controls, where you've got to manage processes really actively versus the ones that rarely change. And, some processes only run every 3 months, some run 10,000 times a day. Understanding that risk profile is really important to being sustainable, because you're going to have limited manpower resources no matter where you work and what environment. And so you've got to be smart about where you channel that energy to get the biggest bang for the buck. And so, one executive I worked with was a real visionary, and he just got process immediately, came in and said, okay, we're going to set up a model office. So we're going to take the processes that are clunky and are causing customers pain, the ones we get complaints about, the ones that the internal people are struggling with, and we're going to redo them in a small incubator environment. We'll just get 5 brainy people. We'll lock them in a room. We'll create models for how things should work, and then we'll have a beauty parade. We'll bring people in, have a look at those models. They'll all get excited about it, and then we'll work out an implementation plan. Right? We did number 1, so we got a mini project spun up. We'll do that. Let's then move on to the second one, that sort of thing. So that was getting a lot of momentum and excitement in the organization about how you can see things changing, literally see them, and then you can see the implementation of those changes. But of course, after a couple of years, that executive moved on, and then the person who came in to fill that role went, no, wait, that stuff's not delivering anything, and let's get rid of it. And so so that value equation, if it's really clear, we were working on value, and in one particular area, we had a good value model for it. But in other areas, we hadn't developed it yet. And so then people come along and go, well, we can't use that. And so this third point around sustainability is, if you understand value and you can communicate it well, then that will really help. Then, as people are moving around, the organization is going to go, no, I still get it, and I can see the impact. And so I want to support that.
Yeah.
I'll keep going so we don't run out of time. So the fourth one is around skills. So once you know who the owner is of a process model, you still need the skill of updating it. As I mentioned, which tool you're using and how do you make those updates. So who has the skill to create new models? Is that all embedded in the business? And if someone needs a new process, do they do it themselves, or is the centralized team doing it? And also the skill of reading the models. So as I said, if we're clear on what's the model used for, is it a communication tool? Do the process owners need to know how to read it? Then that's actually recognize that as a particular skill, because, a lot of times we take that for granted. I remember traveling in Africa and showing people a map and saying, how do I get to this hotel, right? And so many people in Africa just couldn't read a map, right? I'd show them this piece of paper that had lines on it, and they go, well, I don't even know what that is, and I don't know how to interpret it. And so we take things for granted like that. Oh, process model makes sense. I'll show it to someone, then they'll get it. But often they don't. And so if we need people to understand them, then we got to recognize that as a skill and how we're going to create that skill. Mm-hmm. Fifth point around sustainability is consistency. Mm-hmm. And so one is, sometimes people think we just got to automate this whole process. But I think an important part of it is understanding, where does human intervention in a process really add value, and where does it add risk? So I had an example of we did a tax calculation incorrectly, and we didn't realize it for 8 years. And when we realized it and worked out what the impact of that was on customers, it was a couple $1 million. And so one little error then gets compounded into something significant. And so if we'd done a risk assessment on that process and said, if this goes wrong, what might the impact be? We probably would have put a control in there, which we didn't have. Right? So understanding where they add value, and not necessarily making a process bulletproof and consistent, but understanding here's where a human can intervene. They're communicating with the customer. So we don't want to make that rigid and generic. We want to have, customer experience. So we're going to let there be process variation in this spot, and we're not going to let it be process variation in this spot. Another example was paying distributions out of unit trusts. So on one day of the year, they were paying $8 billion in distributions. And so if something goes wrong in that process, the implications are crazy. And so they had this bulletproof manual. They said, you can draw all the process maps you want. We don't really care because we have this line by line. Every single person in the team knows exactly what they're going to do. There's peer reviews all over the place. And, the process is going to be bulletproof. So there was lots of human intervention and the automation of all the calculations was balanced with the whole human side of making sure the outcome was correct rather than just relying on a machine. Oh, it must be right. The machine calculated it. One other point around consistency is, so I've been talking about consistency within a process model, is from one model to another. So one of the challenges we came across is one part of the business calls it something, say, cash in, and another one calls it receipts, and another one calls it payments and customer payments and that sort of thing. And so if you want to make all your models consistent, use the same nomenclature, then you can play it back to a business stakeholder and they go, well, that's not what we call it. So it's not my process. I don't understand it. So having clarity on where do I allow variation because it's going to help my owners really get and adopt the processes versus where we really need consistency so people don't get confused and we can get more reuse. And again, there's benefits either way, but you just want to be clear on which way you are able to go. And sixth and final point is perhaps the most obvious one is funding. So maintaining and managing processes always costs money and it takes people. And so it's a question of if you can get that value we talked about earlier and be able to pair that up with what the cost is and be able to demonstrate that cost is easily outweighed by the amount of value the organization gets from it, then that's going to help with sustainability. Because sometimes in the business cycles, they're in a cost-cutting mode and it's just an easy target for cost cutting. And so you got to be able to defend that and be on the front foot.
That's great. That's so good. I think those 6 key points, I'll just repeat them back because I think for the people listening to this, it'll be good for them to have that clarity around, sustainable BPM and what that looks like. Because I think different people are, they'll have a different focus for each of these, and depends on, I guess, the most immediate challenge that they're facing, whether it's exec buy-in, appointing an owner, understanding value, communicating that value, who has the skills, do we need to upskill, what if the person with the skills leaves the organization or gets transferred, who has the skills, consistency in a model. I think, it's also key for for reporting and having, I guess, that baseline understanding of what are we looking at here? And if changes need to be made, making sure that everyone knows what they're looking at and that they're looking at the same thing, interpreting the same thing. And then funding BPM, that's obviously, and they kind of all tie into one another because, to get that funding for BPM, the value needs to be understood, the value needs to be communicated to get that they all kind of flow into one another. So that's great.
Yeah. And so I've talked about the importance of buy-in, but I didn't talk too much about how to get that because, of course, there's some magic in that and it's not easy. One thing that really helps is linking it to an organizational purpose or vision or values. And with a direct linkage, you can then demonstrate benefit more easily. So, for instance, at NAB, their mission statement is to serve customers well. And so if you unpack that a little bit and go, well, how do you serve customers well? Well, if your processes are a mess and you can't repeat them, that's clearly not going to serve your customers well. So there's an implicit but a fairly obvious tie in there to go, you've got to have pretty good processes if you're going to do that. And one of their values for many years has been do the right thing. And doing the right thing requires some good processes as well. So being able to speak in the language that the executives get and that they're trying to drive in their culture is super helpful. There's the Toyota way, of course, which is, respect for people is one of the 2 limbs in there. And the second one is on continuous improvement. And like Peter Drucker says, you can't improve something you can't measure. So if you're going to have continuous improvement as, embedded in your corporate philosophy, the only way to do that is to have processes. You need some other things as well, but without processes, you can't improve things. CBA is another good example where they've got the values care, courage, and commitment. And I got the words written here so I don't mess them up, but in care, they say, we care about our customers and each other. We serve you with humility and transparency. So to serve with transparency, again, if you don't have a process repository, how are you going to do that? Because you wouldn't even be able to explain to customers what process you're going through. And then for commitment, they say we're unwavering in our commitment. We do what's right and we work together to get things done. So those sort of tie-ins, I think, help connect executives from higher purpose to lower level purpose and value, and be able to back them better. So that'd be my key recommendation on getting buy-in is bring it up to the highest level conversation you can possibly have, and have some tangible quantitative things to back up what you're saying.
Yeah, that's good. I love that. I think understanding what's important to the execs. It's the vision of the organization. It's the values. It's the big picture. It's the how are we creating the future? Where are we going? And I think as process practitioners, we need to understand that to get that buy-in. We also need to think at that level. We need to understand the why. We need to understand why we're doing what we're doing, and we need to communicate it from that level, because then it makes sense. And I guess sometimes on those days where maybe you do get, sometimes it feels like you are getting bogged down into the nitty gritty of whether it's notations or a common language or all of these bits that for some of us it excites us, and then for others it's dull and sort of boring or a bit of a drag. But if it's linked to that overall purpose and the why, it keeps us pushing through. It helps us stay motivated, because it's like, but this is why we're doing this, because of this, because of the why, because of the purpose, because of our values. You know what I mean? Yeah.
Yeah. If anyone hasn't seen that Simon Sinek TED talk on Start With Why, it's 15 minutes of your life well spent. You can apply that pretty much everywhere, but definitely here, you start with why, you're going to have much better chance of success of connecting.
Yeah, that's right. And when you look at the future of BPM, what does that look like? What trends are you noticing? And you obviously outlined 6 steps for sustainable BPM. Is obviously that's a good focus. Is there anything else? Because I think over the last 5-10 years, technology's just been exploding in terms of what's possible with process analysis and governance and automation and all of that. But what are you noticing in the future?
Yeah, I think often when you talk to people about the future, there's some fairly easy answers there, right? It's like, it's going to be RPA, and we're going to get automation and robotics and process insights and process intelligence and that sort of thing. You can see there's tons of opportunity there. But I'm yet to work in an organization who's actually set up and ready to adopt those sort of things, because they're back on the how do we sustain this, and running into a lot of hurdles there. So, I could be cute and say, well, there is no future for process automation if we can't crack the sustainability problem. But I would still encourage people, you really got to put your energy there and focus on, how do I get this thing embedded so it actually becomes part of the fabric and part of the culture? And then we can start to think about process intelligence and more automation. Of course, everyone has a degree of automation already, but those sorts of add-ons can really add a lot of benefit. But not if you haven't cracked the sustainability problem, it's just going to undermine your efforts there, and you're going to keep running into brick walls that make it really hard.
That's great. That's really good for the audience to hear. So, Cameron, I just want to thank you for sitting down with me. There's so much more we could unpack, but in the time that we have had, I feel like it's been very clear and concise, and I think that's good. That's what the audience needs to walk away with is those key points to sustainable BPM. I think it's a challenge that a lot of people face, but I just want to thank you for sitting down with me. I've certainly been gleaning a lot. I've been jotting down a bunch of notes there from my own learnings and my own takeaways, and I'm sure the audience would have as well. So thanks again. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Yeah, pleasure for me too. Great to have a chat, and happy to catch up again sometime in the future.